Well, hello, good evening, everybody. On behalf of House of Books and the Kemp Memorial Library, I want to welcome you all to this evening's event. I'm very pleased you could all join us. We have, of course, two journalists, two authors with us this evening, Jacob Soboroff, author of Separated, and John Washington, author of The Dispossessed. My name is Ben Rybeck. I'm the general manager of House of Books in Kent, Connecticut, which has been independently owned for more than 40 years. And to learn more about the bookstore and to see other upcoming events and to sign up for our newsletter, please visit houseofbooksct.com. We present this event tonight in partnership with our dear friends and neighbors at the Kent Memorial Library. They have, as always, their own slate of quite impressive programming and lots of other offerings. And you should check them out at kentmemoriallibrary.org. I also want to thank Amanda Myers, our tech guru behind the scenes making all of this work. If you'd like to purchase copies of either Jacob Soboroff's Separated or John Washington's The Dispossessed, which I hope you will, of course, please visit houseofbooksct.com/Soboroff-Washington. You'll see that link over there in the chat as well a few times tonight. And if you have a question for either author this evening, please write it at any point in the chat, and we will have a time to turn to those toward the end, and we will get to as many as possible. So once again, please write any questions you have over there in the chat. And now on with this evening's event. Our guests tonight are two accomplished journalists, both of whom have focused new books, both of them put out this year in 2020. Books that focus on the crisis at the United States-Mexico border, looking at one of the most essential issues of our time, exploring this crisis from slightly different but entirely complementary perspectives. Jacob Soboroff is a correspondent for NBC News and MSNBC. For his reporting on the child separation policy, he received the 2019 Walter Cronkite Award for Individual Achievement by a National Journalist and the 2019 Hillman Prize for Broadcast Journalism. He co-presented the four-part event docuseries American Swamp on MSNBC. John Washington is a writer, translator, and activist, a regular contributor to The Nation magazine and The Intercept. He writes about immigration and border politics, as well as criminal justice, photography, and literature. A long-term volunteer with No More Deaths, he has been working with activist organizations in Mexico, California, Arizona, and New York for more than a decade. Jacob joins us from Los Angeles. John joins us from Brooklyn. We're so glad you're both here with us virtually tonight. Thank you so much.
Thanks to all of you, Ben. Thanks to you and to House of Books. And John, it's really good to be here with you, my friend. And thanks to everybody who's taken time out of a busy election season and on a Tuesday night to be here with us. I think the idea is that John and I will both tell you a little bit about our books, and then we'll get into some conversation. We did a coin toss, and I won the flip. So I guess I'll tell you a little bit about Separated Inside an American Tragedy. First, but I will say in reading The Dispossessed, there are a lot of differences, but there are so many similarities amongst, I think, the reporting that we both endeavored to do and the stories that we do our best to tell. And it's part of the reason I'm so excited to talk with you, John.
Yeah,
so
same.
Go ahead if you want real quick before we go.
Yeah, quick hello and thanks, to you, Jacob. I'm, thrilled, I really respect and admire your reporting and just so excited to be in conversation with you. And yeah, your book has taught me a lot and your reporting continues to teach me a lot. As we were saying just before we signed on, like your reporting every day is great. Then yeah, Ben, really appreciate it. House of Books, everyone who's here, glad to have this conversation. So yeah, take it away, Jacob.
Here. And well, I guess I'll just start by talking about how I came into this work, because I do think John and I both have definitely different backgrounds. And I sort of consider, I wrote the book about family separation because I covered family separations for MSNBC and NBC News, but I really truthfully did not intend to. And I really do consider myself an unlikely eyewitness to what, I think became, as I write in the book, one of the most shameful chapters in modern American history. And it's still playing out to this day. We have a news story out literally that we published less than an hour ago about how the lawyers and the government still does not know the location of 545 parents who were deported, we believe, without their kids from this separation policy. And so when I say unlikely, I really do mean it, because I, um, I'd never had a background in migrant advocacy, journalism, work. I don't speak fluent Spanish. I did not intend to cover family separations. I never set out that this was going to be my career. I probably shouldn't have been the person to be there for NBC to cover this, quite frankly. I'm a white, privileged Jewish dude from LA who went to private school. And I mean, seriously, my experience couldn't be further from what my lived experience from these families have gone through. And, but I am from LA. And um, to me, when I joined MSNBC, the idea of not covering immigration would be crazy, because I live in a city that is, um, I don't like the term majority minority. In fact, people of color and Latinx people in the city make up 48% of the population here. It's a Latinx almost majority city. The idea of avoiding immigration as a journalist isn't really an option when you live in Los Angeles. Those are just my neighbors and friends and um, everyday folks on the street here. And so when the president came to office, I was really covering voting issues. And I sort of detailed this in the book about how I ended up covering family separation. And I thought it'd be clever, and I thought it was smart to suggest this, to sort of do a fact check on Trump. And we decided to do a Dateline NBC hour based on the realities of life along the border. And I was going to go on one of these journeys you see people do and kind of check it out, fact check stuff like the need for a wall or not need for a wall. Is MS-13 really streaming across the border in the numbers the president said? And the answer was no. Are drugs coming through in between ports of entry, like the president was saying? The answer was no. They were coming right where people cross legally. And is there a need for a wall? And most people along the border would say probably not. Although, you know, the closer you are to the border, the more nuanced opinions are, and the further away you get, the less nuanced they are. And people that don't live on the border seem to think they know about it better than the people who do live there. Anyhow, in all of this, I ended up sitting down with Kirstjen Nielsen, the Secretary of Homeland Security, for NBC. And I'm sure there's a whole media criticism thing we could do about why and how I ended up in that position, and whether I should have, but I did. And it was there that I met Katie Miller. Her name was Katie Waldman at the time. She became Stephen Miller's wife. And Katie invited me to go see something as a journalist I really had missed. Julia Ainsley, who's now my colleague, but was at Reuters, covered this extensively, family separations. Caitlin Dickerson at the New York Times broke an extraordinary story. Lomi Creel at the Houston Chronicle, now at ProPublica, broke a big story on this. But I literally was driving by it in certain cases when I was doing this border reporting. And Katie invited me to go inside this place called Casa Padre, where Jeff Merkley had been, the senator from Oregon, had been refused entry about a week earlier. I streamed it live. It was carried on Chris Hayes' show, and to let us in. And so she said, you ought to go there. This is the sort of the epicenter of what has become this conversation topic that nobody really knows exactly what they're talking about, other than really the immigration attorneys and activists and people who were going through this on the ground, and a select group of journalists who were covering it, probably John, honestly. So I did, and I flew to Brownsville. I stopped at the Walgreens to buy a notebook because there were no cameras allowed inside. And I went inside this 250,000 square foot former Walmart, where they were holding 1,500 boys, 10 to 17 years old. Detained inside 22 hours a day, 23 hours a day sometimes, depending on the day of the week. Hundreds of them were there only because they had been taken from their parents systematically by the Trump administration. What today I now know was torture, according to Physicians for Human Rights, what was government-sanctioned child abuse, according to the American Academy of Pediatrics, and was a deliberate decision based on the reporting that I've now done, both in the book and for NBC, against the advice of career professionals inside Health and Human Services, the Department of Justice, and the Department of Homeland Security. So I saw just the craziest shit, honestly. Kids watching Moana in the loading dock, the Disney movie of the Walmart. Kids doing Tai Chi, playing pool, playing video games, getting haircuts, in line for a cafeteria, going to the doctor's office. I mean, it was truly a little world inside that that I walked outside and I said to Chris Hayes, live on the air that night, I've been inside a prison and I've been inside county jails. This place is called a shelter, but effectively these kids are incarcerated. I didn't know what to say. I was shaken. And it became that day and that night sort of a growing media story. But I went home to LA, and on, I guess it was probably Friday, my delayed wedding anniversary with my wife, I got another call from Miller, who said, "You got to go back. We're going to let you inside what really is the place where we're separating all the children." And that was the Ursula Central Processing Station in McAllen, Texas. And it was there that I did see, there were no cages in the first facility. In fact, I saw them in reverse order. Um, the shelter is where kids are sent after they're taken from their parents at the processing center. And in that processing center, I did see the children in cage. You know, and I say this now almost in a mechanized way because I talk about this so often, but there is no way to intellectualize walking into one of these places and seeing hundreds of separated children in cages under the Mylar blankets that John also writes about, on the concrete floors, on mats, literally supervised by security contractors in a watchtower as if they're a flight risk, locked up in dog kennels. And it's a sickening thing to recall. It's a sickening thing to see. I cannot comprehend what it is like to be a family in that position, not knowing why you're there or what ultimately might happen to you. But we now know what happened to all of these families, and it's lifelong trauma for each and every one of the children, 5,500 of them, that were taken away from their parents. And I guess I don't want to go on for too long, but what I will say is, at the time, based on my experience and the reporting I had been doing and the lack of experience, frankly, I had had in decades of immigration reporting and policies that some other people have and people like John have, I didn't understand how what I was seeing with my own eyes was truly happening. And now I know. I mean, that's why I set out to write the book. It's why the father and son, who go by the pseudonym of Juan and Jose, they picked the names because they didn't want their names in the book. Why they participated in my book. They were separated from each other and didn't see each other for nearly 5 months. The father was coerced into signing away the right to his child. And were it not for an immigration attorney out here in LA, he probably would have been deported, like literally hundreds of others that were too, like the ones that I'm talking about tonight. And in going to see him at the Adelanto ICE Detention Center, where John writes about the nooses that have been found, I mean, I went inside this place and I saw people curled up in the fetal position on the floor, obviously having mental health breakdowns. It's just, I walked into a world unintentionally that I shamefully did not know virtually anything about. And what I now know in learning about this, both because I think I owed it to our own audience, but also for myself and for the families that I came into contact with that wanted to participate and didn't want to participate in the book, how this could happen, and so that hopefully it never happens to anybody ever again. And John does a much, much, much more thorough deep dive into the origins of all of this. But my sort of Cliff's Notes version of it, as I tell it in the book, is that my framing, I guess, and it goes much beyond, further beyond this into the past, is that this is a deterrence-based immigration policy that sort of on the shallowest end really ramped up under Democratic and Republican administrations, including the Clinton administration with this Prevention Through Deterrence initiative from 1994, that basically was designed to make people take dangerous, deadly crossings into the United States, knowing or hoping that it would scare others from coming. That never worked. It didn't work then. It didn't work when the Bush administration created a Department of Homeland Security and exploded the size of the Border Patrol. It didn't work when President Obama removed, I guess is the technical term, more people than ever before and became the so-called deporter in chief and built the facilities where these separated children were housed in cages that I walked into myself. And it didn't work when he detained families in family detention and literal family jails that are still being used to this day by the Trump administration. And I guess, you know, the big lesson that I learned, and I should have known before I covered all of this, is that what's at the heart of this policy, the idea that you can either scare the shit out of or literally damage human beings into not fleeing circumstances, leaving circumstances behind that are in some cases threats to their life, in some cases, threats to their livelihood, in some cases, existential threats, like I've seen in Chiquimula or Zacapa, Guatemala, brought on by climate change that force poverty and malnutrition and food insecurity. I mean, all of this stuff is stuff that I had to go back and actually untangle for myself. And so I guess if you're an expert in this stuff, this book is not really for you. If But what I found, I think, is there are more people like me than ever would have maybe admitted it before. Um, and I'm glad that people are starting to say that to me about these stories. That this is not a political issue. Yes, Donald Trump did something nobody had ever done before. Um, he supersized immigration policy that had been set up for him to basically flip a switch and start separating families. But it wouldn't have been possible without Democrats and Republicans for decades, and indeed for generations, I think, as John really articulately and with great depth goes into. Um, and so, in the book, you'll see my story. You'll see original reporting about, which is really my reckoning about not understanding that this was happening. You'll see the stories of government officials who both tried to stop this from happening and those who pushed it through, Trump administration officials. And you'll see the story of this father and son who came here not as perfect people. And in fact, they freely admit that. The father had tried to cross twice before as an economic migrant and did so successfully, and kind of laughed when we had dinner one night, said, they didn't catch me. But at the point when he did come back to cross, and he did so with his son, that's when he was tortured by the US government. And the idea that anybody deserves that, based on my own experience, is just reprehensible. And I think that's what I took away from this. Any excuse that is peddled, whether it's a fake family, these are fraudulent families, or these people are coming for some reason other than the stated reason, or they're not really asylum seekers, or the danger they're fleeing is about wanting to have a better job. It's all kind of bullshit when you see what the government does, and what they did specifically in this case. But it's really just the tip of the iceberg. And here we are now in the middle of a pandemic, where when you talk to people who know about this stuff much better than I do, they'll tell you that it's arguably, and it's hard to sort of fathom, worse than it ever has been. And nothing is worse to one child or one parent from being separated from one another. But you've got today 8,800 children immediately expelled from this country under the cover of COVID. You have hundreds of families detained when they could be released in detention centers, family detention centers, where ICE is exploding. You have tens of thousands of people made to wait in some of Mexico's most dangerous and violent cities, under the guise of they're being part of the migrant protection protocols, this weird euphemism. And John has seen this stuff himself. I haven't. So here we are. And I hope that this book, it certainly helped me, and maybe that's a vanity project. I don't know. But it certainly helped me, and I hope it helped other people who are in the same position that I was in, understand things that I definitely didn't at the time. And I'm really looking forward to discussing that with you, John.
Thanks, Jacob. Yeah, very well stated. And I would object to your calling your book any sort of Cliff Notes version. One of the things that I think is a real strength of your book is your own reckoning, that you take the reader through deftly and powerfully. And that just isn't Cliff Notes. That's just like a human reaction. And you put that on the page with quite a lot of aplomb, and it really is affecting. So maybe I'll sort of follow your lead a little bit and talk about how I came to write The Dispossessed. So we do have like slightly different backgrounds. I have been writing about immigration for a while and have been involved in a number of activist groups along the border and in Mexico and in Central America. So I was working on a story for The Nation, and there was a Guatemalan man who had asked for asylum after receiving very credible death threats. And he fled to the United States. He actually worked with the FBI because the people who were threatening him were part of this pretty intense cartel, transnational criminal organization. And FBI wrote him a letter of recommendation saying that his fear was real, and he made his case to the judge. His judge didn't believe him on pretty specious grounds, and denied his asylum claim and deported him. And soon after his deportation, his return to Guatemala, he was murdered. The threats were realized. And there is no greater proof for the need for asylum than when you're not given it, you're murdered. But that proof comes too late, of course. And so I heard about that story. I was really sort of shaken by it. The story itself was about so-called asylum-free zones in the United States, these jurisdictions in immigration courts in the United States where asylum grant rates, the number of cases that judges or asylum officers approve, are just abysmally low, between 0, some judges do not approve any cases, to 3%. And the percentage of the grant rate percentage throughout the country is much, much higher than that. In some states, it's as high as 60%, or some judges is that high. So that was the spark. And I was like, I need to sort of investigate this further. And how many other cases are there like this where we are literally deporting people to their death? But then there's another sort of like more emotional spark to the book. And that is something that I still feel today, almost on a daily basis, at least on a weekly basis. And I imagine, Jacob, this is something that you deal with as well, is how do you grasp the reality? Because unless you're really into it, unless you're really involved, or you're suffering through it, I think it's hard to come to terms to. And you sort of talked about that, Jacob. I mean, your difficulty to comprehend. And that's not because you lack the capacity to comprehend, because it's so extreme. And then we live in this world where many of us live in this world where, things seem relatively peaceable. Certainly not everyone lives in that world, but I count myself as one. And, then you receive these calls as you're reporting this story, or any of these stories, you're just on this beat. For example, like one Cameroonian asylum seeker that I reported on last spring for The Nation, he was deported a few days ago. And he was part of this mass deportation of Cameroonian people who are fleeing what many are calling genocide in the Cameroon. And we know that a lot of them, upon deportation, upon returning to Cameroon, have been picked up by security forces there. A woman from a detention center before her deportation back to Cameroon last week called me before she could get her name out. All I saw on the caller ID was prison jail. Before she could get her name out, before she could tell me a thing about her, she broke down in sobs, near sobs. And just like, how do you grasp that? How do you understand what's going on? And so part of what I wanted to do with the book is try to get close. And one of the ways that I did that was spending a lot of time talking to a couple people, but really my principal subject is Arnovis. He's, when I first met him, he was 24 in 2018, 24-year-old Salvadoran man. And I just really tried to understand his story and his experience. And the way that I first learned about him was through family separation. For a brief period in the spring of 2018, he was, just for a moment, like sort of like one of the faces of family separation. He had been deported without his daughter, Maybelline, who was then at the time 6. She may have been just under 6. And when he left the United States, when he was deported back to El Salvador, he had been told not too long before that his daughter was in either Florida or New York. And he was coerced and pushed and, really like strong-armed into signing his deportation because they told him that it was the best chance of getting his daughter back. So he went back, and he was, his name and face appeared in the Washington Post and the Guardian and a couple other places. And I was down in El Salvador at the time. And I could just tell that he had so much. He was like a really well-spoken guy, and he had so much to tell and to talk about. And what I tried to do is like, all right, I really want to let this guy tell his story. Fortunately, his daughter was returned to him about a month later. She was neither actually in Florida or New York. She was in Arizona. He had also been told previous to that, when he first was separated from her and he was transferred to a different detention center, he said, they tricked him. They told him that she was on the next bus. She never appeared. He's like, where's my daughter? Where's Maybelline? And they said, we didn't know you had a daughter. Similar to the story you mentioned that you published today, is like this inability, or maybe intentional, and I think you got into this too with the Office of Refugee Resettlement chief at the time. Like, maybe deliberately not keeping accurate records, or not keeping track of where people were being sent. But whether it was deliberate or not, it was a reality, and we know that many people were lost in the system or kicked out, and maybe some of them stayed in the United States. So I tried to just get at the heart of his story, and so I traced and literally like tried to trace his journey. So he took a couple different trips, uh, twice by himself, and then when he realized that his daughter was also under threat by the gangs, he was sort of like sandwiched in between. MS-13 was trying to kill him. Barrio 18, Barrio 18 was trying to protect him and offering him some, like trying to recruit him, and he didn't want to, and so they were then after him, and he was just like very quickly after like just an unlucky happenstance, his life just spun out of control. So he fled, made it to Mexico, got deported, fled again, got deported from the United States, and finally fled with his daughter. So what I did was I just try to trace their story, just try to trace their journey, and just go where he went through Guatemala. I spent so much time living with the family itself, like staying in their kitchen. They set up a hammock for me in their outdoor kitchen, and a couple piglets and a puppy slept underneath me. I guess it was like a little bit warm underneath me. And just like, try to grasp what you understand, Jacob, and what I still, struggle with today when I hear these stories, when a Cameroonian woman calls me from detention and just can't get a word out. Just, I tried to grasp it. I tried to like put myself a little bit in their shoes. I know it's impossible, really. And they went on such a harrowing journey that I didn't come close to understanding. I really didn't. Not only were they, guarded over, moved from place to place like they were cattle, threatened with guns. He was shot at by the Mexican Marines at one point. They were stuffed in a refrigerated tractor trailer truck for 54 hours in darkness. A 6-year-old girl, nowhere to go to the bathroom, no light for 54 hours, 100 other bodies crammed in there, moaning, crying, vomiting, just the most miserable, traumatic experience you can't imagine. So that's one piece of the book. And the other couple pieces are, and this is something that Jacob does, very well in his book, is really try to understand the policies behind it. And then, so what is being enacted? Who are the people behind it? What's their motivation? And then what's the history behind it? And then on the last side, and I'll end here in a moment, is I try to understand too, not just the people who are perpetrating such torture and misery and abuse, but the people who are trying to offer protection, who are trying to offer asylum. And what I learned, and this was something that really opened up for me as I started doing the research, is the history of asylum goes back as far as history itself. There have always been some protocols, some practices by which all cultures offer some sort of sanctuary, some sort of relief or security to fleeing neighbors, to people who are persecuted, to the weary travelers. And I uncovered all this incredible wealth of material from the ancient Greeks, who were the first people to use asylum. Sophocles and Aeschylus, these beautiful playwrights that are known for, Antigone and some of their great dramas, also wrote about asylum plays. Or before that, according to ancient Judaic code, there were principles of asylum and refugee baked into, those early religions, all three Semitic religions. And then culturally, before they were institutionalized, every culture pretty much that we know of has some practice of that. There's even evidence that it goes beyond humanity, and that some primate species offer asylum to fleeing primates from different troops. So just like that history, I think, is really important. In the United States, it follows up through Europe in the Middle Ages and in Asia as well. In the United States, we saw it in the 19th century with the abolition movement. There too is called the prophetic tradition of the United States, where people in the North, part of the Underground Railroad, abolitionists, were offering refuge to those fleeing slavery. And that is the first sanctuary movement. Then there was the new sanctuary, the sanctuary movement in the 1980s of people fleeing, again, in the same trajectory, but a different situation, people fleeing the US-backed wars in Central America. And now, towards the end of the Obama administration and the beginning of the Trump administration, we have the new sanctuary movement. This was like the third iteration just in the United States. And Jacob and I both write about some of the churches that have opened up their doors, but not only churches, communities, families, mosques, temples. And I think that is a really important part of the story too, to understand. And I guess I'll finish here. And the reason I think that it's important, whereas like asylum is not a solution to the global inequalities, the global violence, the intensity, the increasing intensity of climate change is not a solution really to all those underlying fundamental problems, but it is a solution to the people who are fleeing those things. And while we work to fix the global inequalities and the extractive neoliberal whatever economic terrorism or slow climate change, while we're working on that project, which is going to take a little while probably, we need to also still be offering asylum to people, some form of safety, because otherwise the numbers are increasing rapidly, hugely. Right now there's 80 million people across the globe that are forcibly displaced. That number is going to hit 250 million, maybe half a billion by 2050. And otherwise, if they're, no one's going to keep them out with walls. And if we don't want to live in a world of global apartheid, if we don't want to live in a world of people amassing on the other side of the border wall, desperate to get in and living in misery, then we need some way to let them in peacefully and peaceably and welcome them into our society. So, in a bit of a barrage of facts and discussion here, that's in short, or in medium, what the book.
Thanks, man. And I just want to say, I mean, I truly did. I mean, I really did learn so much from reading The Dispossessed. Every chapter, I felt like, I could relate to the experiences I had, but it never felt like I was saying, it felt familiar, but it felt so revelatory to me. And it felt, like I wish I would have had the experiences that you've had, because had I had them, maybe I would have been able to understand this better, as it was in the middle of it. And I don't know. I mean, I made some notes. I was hoping to ask you some questions about, um, if you don't mind. Um, I guess the first question is just purely like a practical one. Like, you get into so much. I mean, you get into the history of asylum, like you say, as old as you know society or life itself. But what did you know about this before you set out? Did you learn this in school? Was this something that you did? It was just all research for the book. How did you know even about the particular laws, the IRA, that is some of the foundation of the modern immigration system today? A lot of this is stuff when I was reading and I was like, fuck, man, did this guy just know this stuff, or did you dig this up for the book?
Thanks, Jacob. Yeah, well, some of the more recent history I knew. I mean, just because, I've been embroiled in it for a while. I've been reporting on this for a little while, and then, living along the border. I used to live in Arizona and
I saw
working.
that you did some volunteer work. Now I'm going to interrupt you a little more since we're in the
Yeah, yeah.
conversation part of this, because you did some volunteer work with No More Deaths, I think, right?
Yeah, I'm still involved with them. I was with them for a long time, and I still am like a consultant sort of, and just
That's
like,
cool.
I,
I got
I,
to go out with them. It was honestly another one of these, profoundly sort of vantage point changing positions, going out and seeing what they do.
yeah, I mean, they're most known for putting water out in the desert for crossing migrants, but they've also come into the news a number of times recently. They've been prosecuted three times, or in three sort of sections in the past 15 years for supposedly littering or for aiding and abetting people who are coming across and just giving them water and food and potentially some medical care. But yeah, so to answer your question, some of the more recent history I knew because of that, because of my experience with that, and because of reporting on it. But then I just chased the history. I just kept on pulling on that thread, and I've always been really interested in etymologies, and I tried to understand where the word asylum came from. And I was like, oh, it's ancient Greek. Okay, why? Like, what were they? How were they using it? Like, what was the usage? And like, oh, it came up first in this play by Sophocles. Like, wow, that's interesting. And then just kept on going.
How
And
long did it take you, John, to write this book? I mean, when you going through this process.
it was a little under a year. Yeah. But yeah, so it was I learned a lot by writing it. I mean, as you were mentioning, like, so did you in your process. And I guess maybe that's one question I have for you is, you talk about sort of coming to this topic. Like, did you also change your perspective? I mean, like, besides just like opening your eyes or like learning about something, did it change your perspective or like your political stand?
I think it did. I think I was more when I set out on the border documentary for Dateline. I was, um, and still am in some measure. I can be sympathetic to individual law enforcement officials, like talking with Border Patrol agents on the line. I always felt bad generalizing about the system, and I think I have a much better understanding of the systemic problems that exist. That even if you're the greatest man or woman in the world working for the Border Patrol, um, you can't break that on your own. And I think so. I do think that my vantage point, so to speak, went from one of only on the ground to one where I could look at it through a more critical lens, I guess you could say, based on the way that I was seeing the breakdowns in the system throughout covering this and separations. I mean, even with no more deaths, actually, when I was out with no more deaths for the Dateline Hour, I remember kind of being somewhat confrontational about what they do. And I don't regret it because I think it was a good conversation, but um, I like questioned whether or not humanitarian was the right description, or activist. But it's like now in retrospect, those are stupid distinctions. Well, they're not stupid distinctions, but it's stupid that I wanted to make a distinction, right? They can call themselves whatever they want. What's important is the work that they're doing, which is literally life-saving work for people who are dying in the desert. And to try to, I just think my framing was much different than it is today. And both as somebody who saw this with my own eyes, but also as a father, like of a young kid, now two young kids, but then of like a 2-year-old when I was covering this at the height of it, like I do think, really changed me.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, well, first you got to put people on their heels when you're interviewing them, you got to challenge everything. And that's good. Unless, unless they're, currently being like,
Well, can I say actually, John, about that? Like what I learned about myself as a journalist is that I now reject, I think, the idea of neutrality in journalism or objectivity. I think that everybody approaches anything from their own lived experience, right? And mine was the lived experience I told you at the beginning of this, who I am. And I walked outside that day and I said, these are cages. And I guess it was like semi-controversial to say that, which is, again, so dumb. And what I've learned about what I value about being a journalist is that to me, it's more important to be fair than objective or neutral. And I wonder if, and maybe I don't know how you feel about this, and obviously you are engaged very publicly in activism work, but I feel like there may be a shift amongst journalists to understand that that's okay as long as, look, you can present something that is very clearly right or wrong, as long as you're fair in your presentation of those facts.
Yeah. I mean, we're beholden to the truth. And that, I don't think you nor I would break from that ever.
Right.
There is a history, and I think you're right that people are breaking from the supposedly, and I think ungraspable objectivity that some strive for, pretend to strive for. But, previously, even in the United States, the news media was much more partisan and more openly partisan, and that maybe is better because we need to push each other. Still, I think what remaining beholden to the facts, which is itself its own major dilemma right now. But going back to one thing you mentioned about this idea of trying to understand like the role of a border patrol agent within the system. I think that there is a reality of people who are border patrol agents who are fine, upstanding, whatever, citizens, fathers, etc. But you can't disabuse that, whatever those attributes from the fact that they are guarding over with a gun, a person who has just walked for 5 days through the desert and is, has just been separated from their child, or even guarding over that child. And it is systemic, and you can, I think, report on both sides of it. But the question is, what should you report on? And like, those stories that the Border Patrol has, like, they don't really need to be humanized. Like, no one's really questioning their humanity, but the very act that they are affecting, very act that they're, engaging in, is dehumanizing. And one thing that I feel called to do is to defend people who are being dehumanized in any way through reporting. And I don't shy away from that. I mean, maybe that, and like that stance, or like my open history with activism is barred me from getting a couple of jobs or something. But I think it is important to try to really tell these stories and tell them from the perspectives of the people who are suffering. I'm not the ones who are causing the suffering.
And can I say, I mean, I want to ask you about Arnavis and the story and how and the journey that you took to recreate his journey. But I just say on that, like I'm with you, and I think that it's why I it's why I hope that I'm not the person in this position to tell these stories forever. I read at the beginning of the book, I think there are going to be 54, 5,500 versions of this story. Every child will have their own. And I hope that there's some way, whether it's an oral history, like we saw with the Holocaust, frankly, and like the Shoah project. I mean, I really think that at some point there needs to be simple first person accounts of this that aren't filtered through me or you. And it doesn't matter how good of a job we do getting out of the way. It's they weren't our experiences to live, and I have a hard time with that because I have a guilty Jewish conscience, or I don't know. I mean, it's like these are. I'll never, like back to what you were saying. I will never comprehend it, which is why this is a good pivot point. I so admired the fact that you try to recreate Arnavis's journey, and you went on that journey, because for me, talking with Juan and Jose, it was something that they really didn't want to get into. It was something, I think, for them that was equally traumatic, perhaps, as the separation itself. And as you see in the book, it's totally missing. I talk about their life there, and I talk about what happened to them once they got here, but I don't go into that. And I don't know. I just want to sort of hear you talk about your decision to do that, and how that affected you.
Yeah. I have like so many other things I'd like to talk about, but I think we should probably I'll try to answer this quickly, and then
sure. Do it quickly. Yeah.
If folks can, if folks want to ask some questions as well. But yeah, I like I sort of was saying at the beginning, I just really wanted to try my best to understand what they went through, and try to take the reader through and get some of those details, get some of that color that I think would really help a reader empathize.
Oh, and it does. Let me just say.
But there was a place where I hit a wall, and I think this is something that you mentioned, and we both sort of mentioned a little bit already, but I'm sure you can relate to. And the place that we hit the wall was at the separation. Mm-hmm. And I really got to know him. I spent a lot of time with him. I mean, I lived with them, for weeks at a time, a couple times, and just, was in the kitchen, just doing everything with them, following them everywhere. And he shared with me so much. But sometimes when he got to a couple of moments about the separation, he would break down. He couldn't do it. He would he felt such incredible shame that he put her through as he saw it, he put her through what she went through. And she is now 7. She has never spoken with any professional psychologist or anybody about this, therapist, anyone. And he actually, while I was there, he asked me to just ask her about it. We developed a really strong relationship, and that there too, we would, goof around, play soccer, just play tic-tac-toe together all the time. We spent so much time together. She was really not shy with me. And when I asked her about this, I did it, I think, about 1.5 times, burst into tears. It was like she hit this moment of aphasia where she lost language, and she went and she just hugged her father, and she just buried her face in him, and just couldn't. And I just knew, I saw it. It was just such visible scarring that I just walked away, or just let her go. Just that's it. She literally cannot speak about it. And so I try to relate as much as I can their story, but there is a wall. And I have not gotten over it. Yeah, it's still affecting now. I mean, it's really, you know that there's suffering. It's lifelong suffering, as you mentioned too.
And I think that that's why this story resonated with so many people who had no idea. It's such a visceral. It's not a story. It is a visceral reaction to human suffering
Yeah.
in supposedly the most prosperous democratic country in the world on our own soil. It's not even something that's happening in a far-flung place. It's happening in our backyard, literally in our backyard. There are these ICE detention centers everywhere. There's
There's
one.
over 200 of them.
Exactly. And Adelanto, for instance, is 90 minutes from where I'm sitting in Los Angeles in the middle of the desert. And as you write in the book, it's like the Gitmo. I can't remember if it's the Gitmo in the desert, the Gitmo here in the United States. It's like this island in the middle of the Mojave. But I could drive there faster than I get to Palm Springs from my house.
Yeah. Nuts. I mean, yeah, what's the reality being lived? There's, we barely mentioned, but reality being lived currently in immigration detention.
Correct.
Or in the places where people have been expulsed to in northern Mexico. That's happening as we speak right now.
Yeah.
There are people locked up in those detention centers or in so-called family detention centers.
And I should say, and give you credit, I mean, you broke the story. There's so many systemic problems, but you broke the story for The Intercept of this whistleblower report from Don Wooten that not only alleged these hysterectomies and forced medical procedures without women's consent, but horrific conditions when it comes to COVID-19 in these facilities, which are being played out time and again all across the country in different facilities.
Yeah. It's really horrific, and we could riff on that horror just because we're both just so embroiled in it for a long time. But we don't also want to turn this into like a slasher pick. And maybe we should open up to see if there
some
are
questions in there.
any questions.
Yeah, I'm popping back in just to ask some questions on some people's behalf that have been sent to us. One question that maybe is just some sort of basic information is what are some of the organizations right now that are looking out for these families and providing legal and medical support? And
if I could, John, like the story we broke tonight, there's a very specific and finite group of people who are engaged in the search for. There's many extraordinary organizations, and as I say in the book, I have come to believe they're as important as any first responder on any front line. They're literally doing life-saving work. But the organizations that are involved in the search for the still separated families are Kids in Need of Defense, KIND, the Women's Refugee Commission, Justice in Motion, Al Otrolato is representing them, and then the ACLU. I might be forgetting one of them, but there's literally a search, again, as we talk, on the ground in Central America, which had been temporarily paused because of the coronavirus, to track down and find families that have been separated. And that's just separated families. I mean, there are, whether it's the Florence Project in Arizona or the Immigrant Defenders Law Center here in LA, which also comes up in your book, they're everywhere. I'm sure, John, you have other ones.
Yeah, and those are the organizations, and I wonder, there's probably a couple more, but those are the organizations that are currently looking for those specific 545.
Correct.
But we know that family separation happens in a slightly different context all the time. Mm-hmm. The numbers rise into the tens of thousands, where families, parents are ripped out of their homes throughout the country by ICE, and the attorneys and nonprofit attorneys and the immigration attorneys are fighting for them every day. And it's a different kind of family separation, but it is still like the Netflix documentary, which was really revealing to a lot of people, and I still have yet to be able to finish, but see live or at firsthand a child holding onto her father's leg as ICE is detaining him and pulling him away. And what else do you call that besides family separation? And as you point out a number of times, that is torture. That is, lifelong harm that you're drawing across both of those, parties, the parents and the children. So yeah, it's happening everywhere, and there's many people who are trying to defend against it.
I just want to remind anyone too, if you have a question, please just put it over there in the chat. But another question that was sent to us is we're in the midst of this current election, and these issues have not come up all that often. Does this surprise either of you?
Well, I have hope because my colleague Kristen Welker is the moderator of the next debate, and in all seriousness, I don't know. I have no inside information or anything, but I guess my point is, how can immigration not come up? It was the signature campaign issue of the president of the United States, and we haven't heard him talk about it in the debates or really on the campaign trail. I do think that is deliberate, though, and I have no polling or anything from inside the campaign, but I suspect that they know, that what Americans think about what they did. It was one of the only reversals, if not the only reversal, of this significance of a massive, massive policy that this administration undertook to go back on family separations, even though they're still playing out in a more limited capacity. Um, it's very disappointing, but I'm not surprised because I think that they got hip to, at least before Donald Trump got COVID and all this other stuff, that they were going to make cities and people of color in those cities their target instead of immigrants this time around.
Yeah. I think that is definitely their like swerve in their new tactic. One of the things that it sort of dawns on me about the Republican, the GOP side, or Trump administration side, is that, I don't know that it was ever really just, I think it was, it definitely includes just anti-immigrant animus. I think it was also a political tool. And, under this veneer of nationalism, self-professed nationalism, Trump used fear of, decline in the heartland or whatever, or, they're coming for our jobs. He used those things for his own political gain. And so the fact that he's left these like the essential talking points of his 2016 campaign, or the first 3 years of his administration to the side, just like doesn't serve him anymore. And so it's disturbing and revealing. What is maybe more disturbing to me is the fact that the Democratic ticket hasn't brought it up. And there, what I saw is, Biden himself was part of the, administration that was deporting 3 million people who, didn't do right by Central America, though professed to and wanted to. And I think what it reveals to me that they haven't brought it up either is that railing against the Trump administration's anti-immigration policies is politically expedient for them. Yes. And when they can use it as a tool to just put down Trump or to gain access to voters who are incensed. But right now we're distracted by other things and they're not focused on it. But as you and I both know very well, there is, this ongoing crisis, and the fact that they have left it to the wayside is really, really disturbing. And
John, I just real quick make such a good point, which is I think that Joe Biden knows that if he brings up family separations, the first thing Donald Trump is going to say is, "You guys built the cages that we put those children in," and it's true. What are you going to say? I mean, that is true. Yeah. And so one of the things that I cringed. Speaking of cringeworthy things, the most about is when Michelle Obama at the Democratic convention talked about the fact that the Trump administration caged children. She could have said anything. She could have said, you systematically separated families in a way that no administration had done before. You put these children through what doctors say is torture and child abuse. But she picked this resistance imagery that has become trendy to use in order to oppose the Trump administration rather than to have a critical look at immigration policy. And I think that that's a big failing. And I think one of the great challenges of a possible Biden administration is that people are not going to give a shit anymore because there is a Democratic president, and all of these same underlying issues are still going to be there that I missed, before Donald Trump was the president, just like everybody else. Yet everybody else, I worry won't continue to be focused on this.
I share your fear, Jacob. I really do. Is that you can harness the spirit that is like the anti-Trump spirit, and that's happened successfully a number of times. I mean, the first Muslim ban, the energy that got people to those airports was incredible.
Exactly.
And, Muslim ban 3.0 is enforced right now, unfortunately, but I really worry that people are going to go just like feel accomplished if Biden and
Pat
Harris.
themselves on the back. And and some of the same people that are advising on immigration issues are the same people that were there during the Obama years. And if you talk to people in the activism or legal community that deal with these issues, they're terrified that some of these, they have not staked out positions on what to do about indefinite detention of families or the expulsions that we're seeing. These are all both things that the Obama administration wanted to do, and Trump's doing under the cover of COVID. Are they going to go back on those things? Or are they not?
Yeah, I mean, to like maybe finish this question, see if there's any others, but I'll hazard the partisan take here because you're a professional, Jacob, but all those fears aside, Biden Harris would be just much better physically, emotionally, in all reality for millions of people. So, there's a worry to be had and there's a lot of work to be done, even if they do win. But like lives are on the line, and another Trump administration will be more harmful and murderous and deadly to a lot of people.
No doubt. And one of the most patriotic things you can do, I've since learned, being the guy that was in the dark about this, is dig deeper and criticize the people even that you like.
Yeah.
And I think that's more important now than ever before.
I think we may turn to one final question here that's there in the chat. Alan asking, do the current laws surrounding asylum and et cetera support the possibility of more humane treatment, or is it simply that the laws need to change?
Go ahead, John.
Yeah, I think the laws need to change. There's a lot to talk about here. So the current laws that we have in the books are modified both in practice because they're not always implemented as they are written. So that's one like really important thing to understand. And that goes to the system or culture of abuse, of cruelty that is really, I would say, baked into a lot of the enforcement agencies, ICE, Border Patrol, even maybe cruelty isn't quite the right word, but USCIS, the people who are deciding a lot of the asylum claims. So one is the implementation of the policy, which is lackluster. That's a euphemism. And then the other is that, yes, there are, let me give you one really concrete example, and then maybe I can just briefly mention a couple other things, is climate change, which Jacob, you also mentioned. There is no legal framework at all to find any sort of refugee status or asylum because of climate change. And as I have seen, as Jacob, you have seen, people in Central America are fleeing because their homes are sinking into the ground, are being washed away by the sea, it hasn't rained in 6 years, and there's nowhere for them to go. And so they go fleeing in search of some sort of safety, dignity, anything. And there is no legal framework to accept them. There's no way that they can legally migrate relatively anywhere. And then on top of that, there has been a systematic, concerted, top-down, I would say like kneecapping, sandbagging, undermining of asylum protocols in this administration specifically, but it goes back further, where they're really trying to narrow the grounds by which you can gain asylum. And they've been doing that by executive order, by implementing new regulations. There's a recent regulation. There's so many. I could go on and just like give you all a litany and just like speak for probably 20 minutes about this. One final example is they're starting to charge people. They want to charge people $50 to apply for asylum. If you don't have $50, you can't find safety when you're fleeing for your life. Like that goes so much in contrary to all of the most fundamental principles of asylum. And that is just one of literally dozens and dozens of ways that they want to restrict asylum. So on the books right now, we need something much more dignified and humane written. Absolutely.
Amen. Here. and 5-second thing. I never understood it more than going to Central America and understanding what climate change has done. Poverty and malnutrition and food insecurity and literal starvation may not look like climate change, but it's all interconnected. And until and it incentivizes people to lie when they get here about what they're really going through, because as John said, you can't come here and say climate change has ruined my life, it's ruined my income, I literally have no other option, I'm trying to save my daughter. 5 children in the village of Las Sopas in Chiquimula, where I was, did. And the World Food Program, which won the Nobel Peace Prize, is there saving the lives, but those people can't come here and declare asylum on the grounds that are affecting their day-to-day lives.
Well, unless there's any other questions, I just want to thank you so very much, Jacob, John, for being here this evening to talk about your incredibly important books and this incredibly important topic. So thank you on behalf of House of Books, on behalf of the Kent Memorial Library. Anyone out there who wants to buy a copy of either of these books or both of these books, please do so. houseofbooks.com/Soboroff, Washington. And thanks again so much, guys.
Honored to be here with all you guys. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Jacob. Thanks, Ben. Thanks, everyone, for being here. Really appreciate it.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everybody. Be safe.
Be safe. Have a good night. Thank you all very much.